Hey, how's it guys? So this is going to be a crash course on how to automate pivot table in Google Sheets using Python. Before we dive into the tutorial, I'm going to assume that you have at least some experience using Google Sheets API. If not, then that's okay, you can follow along. I also have a tutorial series covering how to use Google Sheets API in Python, which I'll link the playlist link in the description below. Alright, so using Google Sheets API to work with pivot table is something I consider as a semi-advanced subject, just because there are many moving pieces and components involved creating a pivot table. In this crash course, I'm going to break down the lessons into different videos based on the features and techniques. So let me take a look at my agenda first. Right, so the first thing I want to cover is a few things to know when working with pivot table using Google Sheets API. Right, so Google Sheets API documentation is not the most well-organized documentation out there, at least in my opinion. Unlike the pivot table in Excel, which has many more functionalities and features and is a lot more mature, in Google Sheets, if you create a pivot table, there are a couple of things you cannot do. First, you cannot format the values. So here, let me go back to my Google Sheets. Alright, so in this demo tab, I already create a pivot table. If I go into the pivot table panel, in this panel, I don't have any options allows me to format the values. So that's one of the drawbacks. And secondly, you cannot perform custom sort. In this example, my columns are different months name, from January to December. In Excel, if you create a pivot table with month name, Excel will automatically recognize that it's a list of months. So it's going to sort the month name from January to December. And here I already create the same pivot table in Excel. And that's some of the major drawbacks when it comes to working with pivot table in Google Sheets. Now let's go back to the documentation. Right, so if you go to Google Sheets documentation, if you go to Samples tab, if you go to Samples page, on this page there's a list of recipes. And one of the recipes is pivot tables. And this is the tutorial showing you how to create a pivot table using Google Sheets API. I won't be using the source data provided by Google Sheets documentation. Instead, I'm going to use the sample data set provided by Microsoft Power BI. And once you get to Microsoft, download the Financial Sample Excel Workbook for Power BI. Here's the link to download the Sample Excel Workbook. And this is what the dataset looks like. The reason why I want to use this dataset instead of the dataset provided by Google Sheets documentation is because, for one, this dataset has a lot more information and categories that we can work with. And also, we have more records from this table. So let's see. So if I go to the end of this table, we have 701 record. Actually, no, 700 records. Comparing to the data set provided by Google Sheets, you only have 20 records to work with, which is not a lot. If we look at the sample code, and this is what the Google Sheets documentation provide. Alright, so this is everything I want to cover in terms of the Google Sheets documentation. Now open a blank Python script. I'm going to assume that you already have some experience working with Google Sheets API. So from the import statement, I'm going to type from Google. Here, let me increase the font size. From Google module, I want to import the create service function. And the source code is in the description below. Right, so let's go back to my Google Sheets. In my Google Sheets, I have a tab called Data. And it basically takes the simple data from the Excel sample workbook. I copy the data set to the Google Sheets data tab. And my table starts in row 2. So row 2 is the column labels. And from row 3 to row 702, so these are my data values. On the first row, I'm inserting the column index using the column function. And I want to create my pivot table in this PT tab. Right, so let's go back to the script. Here I'm going to insert my code snippet. Here's my client secret file. For the API service name, it's going to be Sheets, and the API version is going to be v4. For the Google Sheets scope, I'm going to use the spreadsheet scope. Now going back to the Google Sheets, I need to grab the Google Sheets ID. And I'll create a variable called spreadsheet ID. And I'll assign the Google Sheets ID to this variable. Now going back to the documentation, I think this one, yeah, this one. If you go to the Reference tab, under Spreadsheets Overview, if you click on Pivot Tables, you'll have a JSON representation template can be used to create a pivot table. Now let's go back to the script. Right, so here I'm going to create my JSON representation template, and I'll name this template Request Body. Now let me take this template and I'll come out this code block, and I'll cut and paste to the new file. Let me do this. I'll come out this code block, and I'll change the syntax to JSON. I'll put this in a new page. And I'll move the panel to the bottom. Right, so I think that's a little bit better. Now let me delete this code block. Inside the request body, I want to insert the request's property. And it's going to be a list. Inside the list, I need to insert a dictionary. Then I need to type update sales property. Oh, I forgot to mention. So under the demo tab, this is the pivot table that I'll be creating using Google Sheets API in Python. Alright, so let's go back. Under the update sales property, we need to insert the rows property. Followed by the values property. And it's going to be a list. Inside the values property, I'm going to insert a dictionary. And here I can finally insert the pivot table property. Under the pivot table property, I'm going to insert a dictionary. Then I can specify the data source. And it's going to be a dictionary. Inside the source dictionary, I need to specify the sheet ID, where the dataset is coming from. Now if I go back to the Data tab, to locate the sheet ID, it is under this GID value. I'm going to grab the sheet ID, and it's going to be 0. Oh, and this has to be a string. And for the start row index, my starting row index is going to be 1. And my start column index is going to be 0. For the end row index, it's going to be 702. And for the end column index, it's going to be 16. This base index is 0, actually 1. Alright, so that's everything we need to write to specify the data source. Now I'm going to insert the row field. And it's going to be the rows property. Insert list. Let me insert nodes. Data source. And it's going to be row field. Alright, so this is going to be the pivot table JSON template. So what I usually do is I'll keep this JSON representation as my template. So in the future, if I need to recreate a different pivot table, then I can take this piece of code and just copy and paste. Now let's go back to the rows property. Inside the list, I'm going to insert a dictionary. And it's going to be field number 1. If you want to add multiple fields, then you will need to add multiple groups. Then you will need to add multiple groups of this dictionary object. Inside the dictionary, here let's go back to the pivot table. Under the rows field, I'm using country as my column. And country is in column B. Since my data source anchor point starts from A2, so I need to offset the column index by 1. Right, so inside the fields dictionary, for the source column, offset, I need to offset the column index by 1. And some other properties such as, do you want to show subtotals? And for that setting, I'll use show totals. And I'll set the value to true, means that I want to display the subtotal. And for the sorting order, it's under the sort order property. We can set the value to ascending or descending. It has to be uppercase. Oh, I forgot to insert a comma. And if you want to repeat the row headings, so the property name is repeat headings. And I'll set the value to true. And in case if you want to change the label name, and label name is this label name. So right now I'm setting the label as world country. Now I want to change the label name to, let's do country list. And this is everything I'm going to supply for this rows group. So that's the rows field. Now I want to insert the columns field. It's under this purple curly bracket. It's under, let's see. And this is under the rows list. And this will be columns. And it's going to be a list. Right, it's very similar to the rows property. I need to specify the data source. Field number 1. Let's name this to column field number 1. And this will be row field number 1. For the column field, let's take a look. I'm going to use the month name. If I go back to my data source table, and month name is index 14. So for the source column offset, and this will be 14. And I want to set the sorting order to ascending. And I also want to show the totals. And that's everything I'm going to supply for the columns field. Right, so the last group that we need to insert is the values group. And the property name is going to be values. And it's going to be a list. Alright, so this is going to be value field number 1. Now let's go back to the pivot table. Now if I click into the values field, so here's the list of aggregation function that we can use. And I want to sum my values. And for the column, I want to use the profit column. And the index value is going to be 11. Here I'm going to type summarize function. And I want to apply the sum function. And for the source column, it's going to be source column offset 11. And for the label name, I need to use the name property, not the label property. Now let's name the label profit total. I'm going to insert a colon at the end. Alright, so here let me insert another property. And this is going to be the property, how we want to control the layout. And the property name is going to be value layout. And we can set the layout as vertical or horizontal. And I'll set the layout to horizontal. Now this is going to insert to the pivot table field. It should not field, the pivot table JSON template. Now we need to specify where we want to insert the pivot table report. Now let me take a look. And it's going to be a different group from the rows group. And it will be here. Alright, so to specify where we want to insert the pivot table report, we'll use the stars property. And it's going to be a dictionary. And we need to, first of all, provide the sheet ID. We want to insert the pivot table. And since I want to insert the pivot table on the PD tab, I'm going to grab the GID value. And we'll send the value to the sheet ID property. And for the row index, I'm going to insert the pivot table on the 4th row. And third column. Oh, here I forgot the comma. And lastly, we need to specify the field type. And for the field type, it's going to be pivot table. Alright, so this is the JSON representation to create a pivot table using Google Sheets API. Now, to create the pivot table, from the service object, .spreadsheets, .batch update. Here, let me close this file. Inside the batch update method, I need to specify the spreadsheet ID. And the body parameter is going to be coming from the request body object. .execute. I'll name the output as response. Alright, so I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to, here, let me do this. I'll minimize this. And I'll put a spreadsheet side by side. Now if I press F5 to run the script, if we look at the PD tab, on the PD tab, I have successfully created a pivot table using Google Sheets API in Python. And if we just quickly look at this report, So here's the country list, the profit total, month name, and the grand totals for columns and rows. Alright, so this is everything to share in this video, and hopefully you guys found this video useful. And as always, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys on the next video.